All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to my session. I hope you've had a great build conference so far. You guys enjoying it? You like your Xbox? Can imagine. So, my name is Boris Scholl. I'm a lead program manager on the Cloud Platform Tools team, and my team is looking after the diagnostics features in Visual Studio for cloud services. And for virtual machines, we also work very closely together with the website guys. I'm here today to talk about diagnosing issues with cloud applications hosted in Azure using Visual Studio. So, as all of you are developers, you know that's a very, very broad topic. So just to set some expectations here, how many of you are interested in, and there was a room change, so this is, how many of you are interested in troubleshooting and diagnosing cloud services? Good, that's the majority. How many of you are interested in troubleshooting, diagnosing virtual machines? Some, okay. And websites? Okay, perfect. That's what I was hoping for. So I spent the majority of that session on troubleshooting Windows Azure Cloud Services. I'm going to talk you through the tools. I'm going to talk you through how everything works with regards to Azure Diagnostics, what kind of options you have. Then I'm going to talk you through what we have available in virtual machines. I mean, you've probably seen a remote debugger demo. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in detail, like how it really works behind the covers and what you can do with it. And then, if time permits, probably I spend like 5 to 10 minutes on websites features just to list them and say how you can use them. Does that sound good? Okay, perfect. So, in the cloud services section, as I mentioned, what I'm going to cover is Azure Diagnostics, remote debugging, IntelliTrace, and Profiler. And then I have lots of demos, and I hope they work. And I don't need to troubleshoot my demos. So the first thing is, why do we actually need diagnostics, right? We've been talking to lots and lots of customers. We've been monitoring the forums. And one of the most common issues with cloud services still today is environmental differences, right? You develop something on your local machine, everything works fine, you deploy it to Azure, and then all of a sudden it doesn't work, right? Sounds familiar? So I think that's still the #1 issue we've been seeing, and we're trying to address it, and I think we made some progress there. I'm going to talk about that. Then the other thing is really, okay, I developed a service, and now my service is really slow, right? How do I actually identify the bottleneck in a service? What options do you have there? And the other issues is like the typical ones. I know we're all developers. We never write any buggy code, but every once in a while there's a bug. How can you troubleshoot like buggy code? And then there is one thing which becomes more and more prominent these days is the more sophisticated, the more complex services get, and the more you need to correlate events, right? Think about a request hits your web role, right? And then you put something in a queue, and then basically you need to correlate that queue message with the incoming request. So we've been working on that, how we can address that, and I'm going to talk you through that. So this is basically the main issues. So let's start with Azure Diagnostics. How many of you have used Azure Diagnostics? How many of you have struggled using it? That's pretty much the same hands. So for those of you who don't know what Azure Diagnostics is basically the out-of-the-box tracing and logging framework for cloud services. So when you create a project in Visual Studio, we automatically enable Azure Diagnostics, and I'll talk you through in detail how we do that. And then there is an agent. The agent gets deployed to a virtual machine. That's really the very first thing that starts up in a rolled startup event. And then that agent starts collecting information. And that information is application logging and tracing. So for those of you, if you've used system.diagnostics, like trace error in an exception handling branch, then these messages are actually being routed to the diagnostics trace listener and written to storage. The other thing that Windows Azure Diagnostics helps you with is collecting Windows event logs on the guest operating system, meaning the instance of the cloud services. It also gathers IIS logs and failed request logs. On the failed request logs, there's a note. We don't set that up by default in Visual Studio, so you would need to do this manually. It's basically an entry in the web.config. Further, you can configure and specify performance counters. You can add custom performance counters. You can collect crash dumps. You can define custom logs, and you can get some Azure infrastructure logs. For those of you who've seen the table with Azure infrastructure logs and you looked at it, to read that information in there and to interpret this information is really hard. So it's not really what the name says. Hey, I'm getting everything my Fabric controller does. It's really more cryptic, and even our support team requires a lot of time to understand those logs. That's why it's really low on the list. So I think as developers, most important parts are listed here in the priority order. So as I mentioned, Windows Azure Diagnostics, because a lot of people raised their hands when I was asking, have you struggled with it? And the reason for that is it's really, it takes a while to understand how it works, because there are some like, I would say, pitfalls to it. And that's why before I'm going to go into any demos, I'm going to show this slide here, which basically I'm going to talk you through how Azure Diagnostics works and how we enable it in Visual Studio, and then I'm going to show it to you live. Okay? So first, on the left-hand side, there is Visual Studio. In Visual Studio, depending whether you build a web role or worker role, there is an app or web.config. The web or app.config in your project contains the Azure Trace Listener, so it's just there. If you Azurify a project, meaning you have a web project, and I don't know if many of you are actually using it, but if you just have a web project, you can say add Azure project to it. Then we also add that entry to the web.config. And then there's the diagnostics WAD CFG file, which is basically part of a role. And the diagnostics, the WAD CFG file, contains the definition of the diagnostics data that should be transferred into the storage, into your storage. Okay, that's very important. So by default, in Visual Studio, we have that WAD config file in there. We have a designer over it, and we enable errors only. So to avoid cost, because the data is being transferred into your storage or customer storage, to avoid cost, we just enabled it for errors only, but you can change that. So then there is also the diagnostics agent, part of a project. And then once we deploy it to Azure, we built that package. The package has the web config in there and the WAD config and the diagnostics agent. And the first thing that happens here is the diagnostics agent actually starts looking for configuration. So remember, we moved up the WAD config file, which contains the configuration. The very first thing in a role startup that happens is the diagnostic agent starts running and says, hey, I need a configuration. I need to know what my configuration is. There is a precedence to it. So if there is no code in the role on start, it will use the WAD config file. So then it takes that information and writes it into the WAD control container. That's basically a blob container in a table, and you can look for it. It's in there, and it sets an attribute to true. That basically means that from now on, if you have a subsequent deployment using Visual Studio and you do a deployment update, and you change the configuration, it doesn't have any impact, because the diagnostics agent will look into that WAD control container first. Always, every time, and I have another slide that shows that. So basically, you deploy it for the very first time, it takes the configuration out of the WAD config file, and it puts the configuration in the WAD control container. And from then on, this is really the truth, and this is basically what the diagnostics agent is using. So once the configuration is in the WAD control container, and you start your application, your web application, or your worker role, and you use trace.traceError, writes those error messages, the trace listener takes those error messages and writes them to the disk on the virtual machine. So the data is not being transferred right away into storage. There is always a delay of at least a minute. Does that make sense so far? Okay. So the logging is written to the disk, and then the diagnostics agent, based on the configuration, says, okay, I've been told to transfer let's say, application errors every 5 minutes to storage. And then it basically transfers those errors every 5 minutes into storage. This is how it works. It takes a little bit to digest, but once you get into it, it's pretty straightforward. So I was talking about the precedence, right? So the highest precedence really for Azure Diagnostics agent is the WAD control container blob. If there is anything in there that has the element set to its default true, it just uses that configuration. And that's where a lot of confusion comes in, because you already have a configuration in a WAD control container, and then people are trying to adjust the configuration through the WAD config file, or they make some code changes and they wonder why it's not being picked up. And the reason why it's not being picked up is really because the agent looks there first. So let's say it's a clean deployment, there's nothing in there. The next thing the diagnostics agent looks at is the imperative code. So I don't know if you've realized that when you create a web project, we have a role entry point. There is a webrole.cs, which is the role entry point. So in the role on start, you can basically also, you can code the diagnostics configuration, and that's what that means. There is another way to directly update the configuration of that control container, and this is if you use the role instance manager. Then it writes directly to that blob. The third one is the diagnostics configuration file. That's the one we're using in Visual Studio. And the reason why we're using it in Visual Studio is really, we've been talking to the Azure Runtime team, obviously. We've been working really closely with them. And they want to get away from that code-based approach. And the future is really like, okay, I want to have a declarative way of defining my diagnostics configuration. And that's the WAD config file. And then if none of those things are provided, it basically switches over to a default configuration. And by default, it's collecting the Windows Azure logs, which are the application logs, IIS logs, and infrastructure logs. But it's not transferring anything to storage. Okay? So with that, I'm going to start my demo. So here I have a fairly simple project. It has a web role, a worker role. If we look at, sounds familiar, it has more than just hello world. It has a data access layer. And if we look at the home controller, everything is handled asynchronously. And the way I'm handling my errors in here is basically I defined a log unexpected error attribute, which is based on a action index result event. If I go to the definition, what I actually do here is I say, okay, in the action, if there's anything happens in the action, just grab that error that was thrown in that action and write it out using trace.traceError, right? So everything that happens in that method is being written out to trace.traceError. So I haven't configured any diagnostics whatsoever. That's like I just wrote my code, I added a project and everything, and I'm good. Let me just exit. So I haven't done anything. I haven't set up any configuration for diagnostics whatsoever. Just wrote my code. Okay. So let's see what's happening. Typical example, I'm going to F5 my application. Takes a while, fires up the emulator. So once the emulator comes up, takes a little bit longer because I have two roles in there. So, and here it is, just to prove it works. I'll say, hey, I build, I grab an image. What the application actually does is it's very simple. It's based off the guestbook example that we have in the training kit. It's just a little bit modified with asynchronous and things to meet best practices. Okay, so I signed the guestbook. here it is. And then if I refresh it, I should see my image. So it works locally, right? We've all been in that situation. Now, let's say I want to deploy the application to Azure, right? And I'm going to go in here. I say publish. So remember, by default, we turned on Azure Diagnostics. Everything's there. But yet, there might be a situation where you deploy your application and you don't even get to that state to analyze it because your role is cycling. How many of you have seen the role cycling? Okay. So before I'm going to go further, I'm going to show you what you can do about role cycling. So my worker role, as you can see, is restarting here, right? And that's hard to demo. So it's basically either it's restarting or it's cycling. You get that state, and once you deploy it, you see it in the activity log. That's why, the reason why I have it in there is it's always best practice to enable remote desktop. Because what you really want to do now is you want to remote desktop into that machine because the machine is already available, just the runtime doesn't boot up when the role is cycling. So if you go to that machine, which I have here, it's just a Windows server, basically. What you can do is, it's very as simple as that. You go to the event viewer. In the event viewer, you have application logs and services. And I was expecting that. So, and here I have Azure, right? So if I look at the Azure category, I see that I have an error here, which is thrown by the runtime, right? So now if I just go in there, and that's really just Windows event logs at that point, and the only reason why that is possible is because the agent is already on the box, remember? And the agent writes data to the Windows event log. So in my case now, if I look at the exception, I see it has something to do with some table storage requests. And if I drill deeper into it, it says no connection could be made because the target machine actively refused it. And if I look at the IP, it's actually trying to reach the local host, right? So typical problem, what happened here is I just haven't set the right configuration. It's a very common example. And there are a couple issues, and I'm going to show you another example with a mismatched configuration. But this one happens, let's say, if you, in your start of your worker role, if you initialize your storage in there, in the code, and it cannot initialize your storage objects, and it throws unhandled exceptions, then basically the role cannot start, right? And it gets into the cycling state. There is more to it. If you look at, let's say there is nothing in this event log, what you could also do here is you can go to the machine, and you can go to the resources folder. So the resources folder has logs. It's WA host bootstrapper logs. The bootstrapper is responsible for reading the configuration of that machine and booting up all the services. So if you just look at this one here, and you see that it's actually, here it gets into the cycling state because it says WA worker host exe. That's the runtime. That's the Azure runtime for worker role. Exits or reported client status 2. Client status 2 basically means there's an error. So those are really the two places you can check if your role is cycling. And it's really simple in a dev test scenario. If you publish it to your test cloud service and your role is cycling, just remote desktop into the machine and look at those logs, and then you'll find the reason. Okay? So let's switch back to Visual Studio and assume I fixed my code, I fixed my configuration, and let's go to the configuration now. So in here, it's my web role. Let's make sure I have a proper configuration. I have a proper connection string. Let's go to the worker role and go to settings, go cloud configuration, and here I have a proper connection string, right? So I fixed my connection strings. Nothing points to local connection anymore, or to local storage emulator anymore. So I'm good to publish it. Right? So now I'm publishing the application again. And for the sake of time, of course, I'm not doing it here. But the application is published. And if I go to the application, I get this error here. Just do a little refresh. So with this one, we're already one step further, right? Our role is up, I get a website, nothing cycling, but I'm getting the error. So that seems to be like an application error again. Now think about what I've been telling you guys. I haven't set any configuration yet, nothing, right? I just deployed it with all the default settings in Visual Studio. What I can do now, just to make sure you see this, I'm using build GB demo 2, that's my cloud service for this one. I go into Visual Studio, and then I go to the build GB demo 2 service, go to the production slot, I see my web, my worker role. I know my web role has an issue, all the instances look fine. What I can do now is I can say view diagnostics data. So in the view diagnostics data, if I keep refreshing it, what we do here is, remember in the default setting what I told you, we transfer just the errors over? So what we show you in that diagnostic summary page are the errors that have occurred in your application if you have like trace statements in there. So if I refresh, probably it takes now a minute. If I keep refreshing it, then it should show the error, why I'm having still an issue with my application. And the reason why it's taking longer is, remember that I said the diagnostics agent logs everything locally and then transfers into the storage? So there are two things that impact that transfer time. There's first the polling interval of the agent, where the agent actually looks, hey, should I transfer data over into storage? And then there's the default storage transfer time, which is also a minute. So at the very maximum, you can look at 2 minutes until the data show up here, right? But let's try it again. So now I have the error, it was probably a minute. Now I can look at the error, and I see I still get another configuration thing. It says the remote name could not be resolved, B shall demo table, and then, okay. So I had another configuration error. So now you could say, Boris, you should really learn how to configure your roles. But this is really very common, and what I wanted to show you with those two little demos is, okay, first one, how to easily troubleshoot a role cycling event. And secondly, if you don't do anything in Visual Studio, we'll basically catch the errors for you and we'll show it there. So now let's look at how we do that, okay? So it's a summary page. If I go to the role designer again, and I look at the role designer, we have this new section here. Actually, we have it for a while now, but not a lot of people are aware of it. It basically says enable diagnostics, errors only. That basically means what we do here is we package the diagnostics agent for you, and we put a configuration file in there, the bad configuration file that is set to errors only. So assuming you're in a dev scenario and you know you really want to look at your verbose data already, you can switch it to verbose, and then we set everything to verbose, and basically all your trace levels are being transferred to storage. Or you can go to custom logs, and if you go to custom logs, you get this nice little UI over the diagnostics configuration file, which basically allows you to change the levels here. It allows you to enable additional data sources for Windows event logs. It allows you to set performance counters. It allows you to set the data for infrastructure logs. And it allows you to set log directories here. So there is this quota. As you can see, there's always the quota associated with it. The quota is being calculated by us because that's also a very common point of confusion. And down in the wizard here, or in the dialog, we basically calculate how much quota you have left for storage. And the quota, in a very high level, basically defines how much storage you have available on your virtual machine in the log directory. Okay? So this is what you would do when you basically deploy it. Again, everything is set up by default. What we do is, if you don't, during publish, if you don't specify a special storage account for the diagnostics data, we basically use the default storage account that you use for publishing, and that's what this checkbox here indicates. Okay? So that basically means, in my case here, I have a special storage account. I'm basically using a dedicated storage account for diagnostics data. But in case you don't set anything up, the storage or the diagnostics data would be collected or transferred into that storage account you use for publishing. Okay? So now think about what I mentioned before. The problem is, if I changed it now and I did a deployment update, it wouldn't pick up that configuration because of the precedent. Right? We also thought about that. What you can do now is you can actually go to the role itself and say you want to update the diagnostic settings for that particular role, which gives you the same dialogue, but this one works directly against the WAD control container configuration. So it updates it directly in there. That also means if you make any changes there and you set it to verbose and you're paying for storage, you might want to revert it once you've gotten all your trace data in there. Right? But that's the biggest difference. And then also to point out here is really, okay, you can basically set it on a role level. That means the configuration you select is being applied to every single instance. Or let's say you have an instance that it's behaving like poorly and you look somewhere and you see the instance is cycling or doing something you wouldn't expect or is not taking any traffic, then you can actually set it on the instance itself as well. And that's basically here. But overall, takeaway here really is that dialogue really works on top of the WAD control container. And if you're in Visual Studio and you publish it, that basically works against the WAD config file. Okay? So now I've shown you how to troubleshoot role cycling. I've shown you how to use the tools. I explained the tools. Now let's say I published it and I have another issue, right? Logical error, what I mentioned in the beginning. You've probably all seen the demos about remote debugging for IaaS. We, of course, also have a remote debugger for PaaS, right? And for that, let me switch to another project because I think that's a better demo. So in here, I have a web role, and it hosts a very sophisticated calculator. And because the calculator is so sophisticated, it only does add operations, I decided to write a C++ DLL because it's faster, right? So what I want to show you here is, let's bring up the website. The debugger and of the calculator. As you can see, it works, right? Let's say, okay, now I want to debug it. And the reason why I'm showing you that really is not because it's a great application that I built and spent a lot of time. It's really about the capabilities of the remote debugger here. So now, similar to the diagnostics configuration setting, I can choose to attach the debugger on a role level or on an instance level. The difference is if I have 4 instances in a role and I set a breakpoint and I attach it to the role level, it breaks whatever instance hits the breakpoint first. Okay. How many of you, by the way, have used the debugger? Do you like it? Okay, cool. So now you'll see, for those of you who've used it, you'll see a change here. Let's go to attach debugger. So in the previous releases, what we've done is, based on your role, we attached automatically, let's say you're in a web role, we attached automatically to W3WP and to WAIS host.exe. Right? But now we've gotten a feedback that in worker roles or even in web roles, you might install some software during startup tasks and they're running some processes, you want to debug them. Right? So what we do now is, we bring up that attached to dialog, and for developers, that's the familiar dialog that you can see in Visual Studio, that you get in Visual Studio. And then you can select and you can say, okay, this time I want to debug managed and native code. I really want to do interop debugging, okay? So I'm going to hit OK. And then, because my calculator runs on a website, I'm going to select the W3WP process. And then I'm going to attach the debugger. It tells me now that because I chose interop debugging, what's happening with interop debugging is as soon as I detach, it usually kills the process that it was attached to. The role will recover it, but that's just a warning that it says, hey, okay, let's do this. Okay, so let's try it again. Let's see if my method works. 2 plus 5, calculate. So I'm going to hit the manage code right now. Then I'm going to step through it. And sum is my first C++ function, which is basically defined in the C++ DLL. So if I'm going to hit F11 now, I'm going to step into the native code. I can step through the native code. Within the native code, I can step even further. Now I'm going to go into the body file, CPP. So I keep going. I'm going to step through that. I can use all the features that I have. Now I see I have 2 plus 5 is my operation that I entered. I keep stepping through it, step out of this, be back in manage code, and now I get my result. So this is the debugging functionality. With that one, you can really, in a dev test environment, you can really trace down like logical errors in your code, especially if, what I mentioned in the beginning, there's some differences between your local environment or something works locally and it doesn't work in your test environment. So this feature is really meant to be in your, let's say, like test pre-prod environments, right? You could technically attach it to a production instance because the debugger will detach, but recommended is really to use it in a pre-prod environments, not so much into production environments. Okay? All right, let me switch back to the slides here. So what we've just seen is the remote debugging. The way I enable remote debugging is very simple. I do it basically the same way I do it. Let me switch back. When I publish my application, I'll say publish, and then in the publish dialog, under advanced settings, I just say enable remote debugger for all roles. That's how I enable the debugger for cloud services. Okay? So switching back. Again, as I mentioned, the debugger is packaged as a plugin, as opposed to the IS debugger, what you've seen in the keynote, which is applied dynamically. It's a different concept behind it. It needs to be enabled during publish. And for those of you who are really concerned about security, because if you used MSVSmin before, the only way was to connect was using basic authentication. We have a cert-based connection there. From a debugging functionality, what we introduced in this release is you can attach to role or role instance. We've done that before, but the new thing is really that you can attach to any process on your machines, that you can do interop and native debugging, and then all the rest is the remaining Visual Studio debugging features. So moving on to IntelliTrace and Profiler. How many of you know what IntelliTrace and Profiler is? Okay. So IntelliTrace and Profiler are basically two ways, two troubleshooting methods that you can still enable in cloud services. And the way you enable them is also through the publish dialog in the advanced tab, because you can basically say, okay, you want to enable IntelliTrace or Profiler. IntelliTrace is really your flight recorder. If you enable IntelliTrace, it's basically historic debugging. It goes out there, you publish it, you enable it, and it basically captures all your events that are ongoing, and then in Visual Studio you can basically say, hey, show me the IntelliTrace data. It pulls down the IntelliTrace file, and you can start like historic debugging with it. Okay? That's really good if you have things like your role doesn't start, and let's say the methods that I showed you doesn't get you any further. You could also turn on IntelliTrace and try it again, because IntelliTrace is also applied very early in the process, and that's usually a common way. It used to be the common way to detect missing assembly references. On those things, we've really improved our tooling as well, because before you publish and you do a package, we basically let you know, we have a list and let you know which assemblies are already on the box. So it's also great for chasing down logical errors. Let's say you deploy it in your test environment, and then an error happens every once in a while, right? And with that, with IntelliTrace, you can basically record it and then rewind back and jump into it and see what caused the issue. Profiler, on the other hand, is really good for analyzing performance issues and bottlenecks through instrumentation. But also it detects if you have inefficient algorithms, or if you are running into any log, thread logs through sampling. Let's switch back here and look at how you enable it. So basically, the way you enable IntelliTrace or profiling is here just through the checkbox. IntelliTrace, you go to settings. You can basically say what you want to do, events or call information or events only. You can define what modules should be monitored and things like that. So this is really straightforward IntelliTrace usage. And Profiler, on the other hand, and now you'll see something here happening. If I enable Profiler, I basically uncheck IntelliTrace because both agents are mutually exclusive, so you cannot deploy both. You can only deploy one of those agents into Azure. And in here, you can set up things like CPU sampling, instrumentation, memory allocation, and concurrency. What the Profiler is really good at is if you're having any ADO.NET calls, if you're calling databases, there is that feature which lights up, I think, starting with the premium SKUs, that says enable tier interaction profiling. And that feature basically monitors your ADO.NET calls. And if something's slow on your data end, you will see that in there. Okay? So this was really everything on cloud services. Again, just to recap on cloud services, we set up diagnostics by default. Everything is enabled as long as you use trace.traceError. Everything works fine. We allow you to configure it for the WAD config file as well as against the WAD control container. We provide you with a rich debugging experience for cloud services. And then there are those tools like IntelliTrace and Profiler, which are really helpful for you. For IntelliTrace, if you want to do historic debugging, Profiling, if you want to chase down performance bottlenecks. So moving on to virtual machines. So on the virtual machine side, logging and tracing is really something that is not there, because remember, the Azure Diagnostics framework is currently it's only available for cloud services, right? So if you host an application in virtual machines, you need to take care of this yourself. And I'm going to show you a really good way, the way we think tracing and logging should be done on virtual machines. And let me switch back here, which is basically ETW-based semantic logging. How many of you have heard of semantic logging? Okay. So how many of you have heard of ETW? Okay, good. So I think it's easier if you look at it. Let's switch the application. It's still the guestbook application that I was showing, but this one is slightly different, right? Because now if you look into my roles, I only have a worker role. I don't have a web role. My web, on the other hand, is hosted. This is my website. It's still the same website, but this one is hosted in an Azure virtual machine. And I think Mark really showed, and Corey showed how our tooling really helps you to spin up those machines to enable web deploy and things like that. So, but the architecture of this application is, I have a website which runs on IIS in a virtual machine, and then I have a worker role that picks up all those messages, and that's basically running in a different cloud service. So then I have a business logic layer, which contains like business logic for writing data back to the store, also retrieving data. Then it has the data access layer in there. And this one is also slightly different because this application writes the blob content to Azure storage and writes the data to SQL storage. So that's why I have two storage objects here. And then the thing here, what I want to draw your attention to is really, I have a logging folder in here, and that logging folder is called guestbook event source, right? So if I look at this, what it really is it derives from event source, which is basically ETW-based event source. And what I'm doing here is I put some structure behind my logging, right? I define events and say, for example, okay, event number 1, the message is edit entry to table storage, and the level is informational, right? So, and I do that for a bunch of things in my application. So granted, this is a lot of effort up front, or it's more effort than just using trace.traceError up front. But what you'll get out of that is really semantic structured logging. And think about, you have a large service and it's producing log data over and over again. You want to have a decent way to look at the data. You don't just want to have strings somewhere around, right? You really want to be able to do this. So in here, I defined my events. And if I go to the home controller, if I look, for example, at add the entry, what it does here is I'm saying, okay, here I'm trying to add an entry to the guestbook. It's an asynchronous method. If this one fails, I'm having an exception. And then for my code, it's really easy because I'm using the guestbook event source class. I say log and then entry at API called failed, which is basically the method that I defined and associated it to the event. Right? So that also already makes your code a little bit cleaner, but because it's not just trace.traceError, you really know what you're logging there. And it's a really great way to implement tracing and logging in complex environments. Let's look at it how it looks like in action. So this is it should be my VM host. All right, let's do it again. Okay. Connecting. And then, okay. So, by the way, using semantic logging or what I've done there, you can also do that, or it's even recommended in like cloud services. You can do exactly the same thing in cloud services. What you would do is, you should go to our patterns and practices site. There is a semantic logging application block, and it tells you how to enable it for cloud services, because what you actually end up doing is packaging the agent and pushing it out to the cloud service, and then it logs the data. So what I'm doing here is, it's called, I'm running it out of proc. So I'm running the semantic logging service.exe, and I said, hey, log the events out to my console, right, so that I see what's going on. And if I make that a little bit smaller and go to my website, as you can see, this is my website hosted on the virtual machine. It's not in the cloud service anymore. Let's do it here. Load, browse, and then add another picture. And then let's see if we can do this. Hope that works. There you go. So as you can see, there is no delay whatsoever, right? It's basically printing out. I just added it, and I showed you like the trace statements in my code where it said, hey, event source, guestbook event source, entry added, event. And that's basically thrown, or this is basically written out right away. And here, I've basically writing it to the console window. And here you have the information. This is just for like, okay, that's really good for demo purposes, but in reality, you want to log that data to a database or a table storage. And that's really just a setting in here. If we go to the configuration, I go to in here, And what I've also done is, this one I say, okay, log it out to the console, but I'm also saying, please write it to Azure Table Storage, right? So if I'm now going to switch back to Visual Studio, into my project and go to my storage node, and once it expands, all right, so as you can see, I have a lot of storage in here. Here I have a table which I called ETW guestbook events. If I go drill into that table now, and I open it up in our storage tools, you can see the data is also logged in here, and it's in a very nice format. You even have like the payload in here and everything. So I hope now it's in a very, very nice formatted way. It makes it easy to query. So the takeaway for that technology is really that's what we think is a very good approach for larger scale service or for any type of service. And it really works well for cloud services as well as for applications that you host in virtual machines. Okay? So this is how we would do tracing and logging as opposed to in the in cloud services world. Then how many of you have seen a debugger? Just raising hands. Okay, a couple. So let's say, let's see, just need to get, so here I have my home page. This is my website hosted on a virtual machine. It submitted this one, the entry, but the picture is basically not being rendered, right? And you've seen it before, it should actually render the picture. So now I don't know what is the cause. What I can also do in here is I go back to Visual Studio, I select my virtual machine, and let's say go to the home controller. I'm in my home controller, I'm adding a method. Let's go to this definition and then see, because I kind of suspect that it's got to do with this. So I'm setting a breakpoint, and what I can do now is I haven't done anything. I haven't set up anything, right? I just can go in here and say, okay, enable debugging. What that does is it basically pulls down the debugger package, MSVS1, which is the remote debugger, the Visual Studio remote debugger, plus a component that we put in there together, which is one package, which we call an extension. It pulls it down from a storage in Azure, and it applies it dynamically to the virtual machine. What it does also is it's not just that the debugger gets up there, but the debugger also gets started up with certain parameters. So what's happening now is it's opening, it's adding firewall rules, it's opening ports on your virtual machine, and so that the Visual Studio instance can actually securely communicate with your virtual machine. And again, this one is also secured using certs, so there is no basic authentication whatsoever. It's really secure. So now it says, okay, the extension is applied. If I look at the virtual machine now, I see a bunch of endpoints here, which is RD-ConVS 2013, so it's a little bit cryptic. But basically, those are the endpoints we add to ensure the communication with the debugger. And now I can go in here and say, okay, I want to attach the debugger. And I get the same window as I was showing to you guys for cloud services. And in here, because I know it's all managed code, I don't have any native code, I just grab the W3, WP process, I attach the debugger, Visual Studio switch it into debugging mode, and symbols, if I'm gonna go in here now, where's my page, try it again. Or is another image. Grabbing this one again, sign guestbook, and now I'm hitting it. So with no effort, I was able to enable debugging on a virtual machine. I'm really debugging the virtual machine there. I didn't have to do anything, and now I can debug my code and see what's really wrong there. Okay. Going back. So, as I mentioned, the debugger is slightly different. The functionality is the same, but the difference in Windows, in our virtual machine debugger and the past debugger is really the way you enable it. Remember, for cloud services, you need to package the debugger, our debugging package, and publish it, so it's always there. It doesn't do any harm, by the way, if you're concerned that it takes performance away or something. It doesn't do anything until it gets attached. In this way, for virtual machines, we really apply an extension, and that's a very unique way of doing that. So we basically took advantage of the new extension functionality there. The debugging connection is secured using certs, and there is one thing, the only thing you really need to be aware of, but that's usually done by default. Remote desktop needs to be enabled on a virtual machine, and I think that's always the case. I think you cannot even do it without it, because it's basically using the remote desktop cert to secure it. It's grabbing the thumbprint that we know this is really the machine we want to attach to, that there is no man in the middle or something like that. So the last one what you can do here is really application insights on virtual machines. I don't want to go too much into detail. I just want to mention it. There have been like a bunch of sessions on application insights this week, and I think the recording's going to be available. But in a nutshell, application insights is really great. If you want to check the availability of your application, it has very rich dashboards. It lets you drill into how your application is behaving. Is your application responsive? And if it's not responsive, it really lets you drill into the root cause of the problem there. And it also has some nice, it also comes with some nice usage data. It's almost telemetry data, so you can actually add JavaScripts to your websites, and then you know the browser versions and things like that. So it's a really, really rich service, application insights, that we provide, and I highly encourage you to check that out. Again, there have been a bunch of sessions on that already. So the last one is really, because I showed or I talked about the profiler on cloud services. So we don't have this nice way of enabling the profiler on a virtual machine as we do have in cloud services. So if you want to use the profiler, you really have to do it manually. So you need to get the bits on the machine, and then you need to execute a bunch of command line scripts to collect the data, and then you can just look at the data. So this was it for virtual machines. I think I've shown you what is a great way to enable tracing and logging for applications on virtual machines. I showed you the debugging feature. I showed you application insights, which takes you a little bit further with regards to UI. It also provides you like live site monitoring, so because debugging is clearly a dev test feature, right? And then I talked about the profiler, what you need to do in order to enable a profiler. So the last thing is the websites, and the only thing I want to do here is just mention what websites functionalities we have. So websites, as I mentioned at the beginning of that session, websites and us, we work really closely. So the functionality is definitely on pair, and there are some things that are in websites available which is not in cloud services. So for configuring diagnostics in websites, there is a really easy way to enable web server logging. It's the same thing, IIS logs, failed request logs. You can enable detailed error messages. You can enable application logging. So if you use system.diagnostics, those things are logged automatically. And the difference is, remember, in a cloud service, I told you you need to have that trace listener in a web.config. You don't need that for a website if you deploy it to a website, because on website, the website infrastructure basically provides you with that trace listener. So you don't need to worry about that. And another cool feature on websites is really streaming logs. So you can see a live output of your logs in the console by just turning on, enabling logs, and then basically every trace statement that's written out is going to show is shown in the output window. Website also has a debugger, similar to ours, actually behind the scenes. It's the same technology almost. The They support Visual Studio 2012, Visual Studio 2013, and the difference there really is the debugging functionality. Obviously, because websites, they don't run any other processes. Well, now they started with web jobs, but currently it automatically detaches to the W3 WP. So there is no other thing you can select. Doesn't even make sense because it's a sandbox still. And you can also use the common debugging features there. So as a summary for that session, it's really, I hope I have shown you this Visual Studio. We're really working hard in providing you a compelling diagnostic story for dev test. We start with like, okay, making it really easy for you to enable tracing and logging. We give you all the tools, the familiar tools you use for on-prems, like the debugger and things like that. So it's really, diagnostics overall for cloud applications is a key investment area for us as Microsoft, and we're gonna continue invest in that area. The new application insight service is really powerful. And as you've seen, investments are not just made for one particular compute container. So for example, we have now remote debugging for cloud services, for virtual machines, for mobile services, and for websites. So pretty much all the features you see in one compute container sooner or later light up. So we're really putting some effort and consistency there. Last slide, I was asked to put that in there. There's some special offers here. I've probably, have you seen that slide? Go to msdn.microsoft.com special offers. There's some cool offers for MSDN subscribers. And then the last slide is really a feedback slide. Please fill out the evaluation. Feedback is really important for us because we consistently want to improve quality of our sessions. With that, any questions?
We use WCF services a lot. We use Azure to get diagnostic information from those. Do you lose anything when you go to App Insights?
So the question is, gentleman is using WCF and App Fabric a lot. If you lose anything, if you go to App Insights. So where are you hosting your WCF services? Sorry, say it again? Okay, so I can't answer that question 100%, so I would encourage you to talk to one of those App Insights guys. I think sooner or later it will be available, but currently because it's a beta feature, it's only enabled on certain functionalities yet. So that's fine. All right. Thanks so much, guys. Have a nice trip home.